The confrontation between Trump and Jasmine Crockett highlights the struggle between authority and fearless opposition, a theme that has always been at the core of political dynamics in America and beyond. When figures of authority attempt to exert control, especially in public spaces, it is not merely a question of protocol or order but rather a test of how dissenting voices will be treated and whether they will be silenced or heard. In this particular instance, when Trump reportedly called for security to remove Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, it immediately framed the moment as one where power was being used to suppress. The symbolism of authority commanding removal of an opposing figure speaks volumes about the balance of power in political discourse, and the reaction from Crockett revealed how resistance can shift that balance in unexpected ways. Such clashes are not simply about the individuals involved, but about the message it sends to the wider public who watch, analyze, and draw lessons from them. People expect political leaders to uphold the values of debate, discussion, and disagreement, but when attempts are made to shut down those values, resistance takes on even greater significance. What makes this confrontation so impactful is the nature of Trump's approach to authority. He has long been a polarizing figure, often using blunt force in his language and actions to dominate the narrative. His supporters admire this decisiveness, interpreting it as strength and refusal to back down, while his critics see it as authoritarian in nature, a tendency to bulldoze rather than persuade. When authority is exercised in this manner, especially in an environment where opposing voices are essential, it creates a theater of power that either silences or sparks resistance. In Crockett's case, the attempt to silence her had the opposite effect. It empowered her in that instant. The act of speaking before being silenced was not only brave but also symbolic of a broader political reality, that authority does not always succeed in drowning out opposition. In fact, attempts to suppress dissent can sometimes magnify its force, creating ripple effects far beyond the moment itself. Jasmine Crockett's opposition in this confrontation cannot be seen merely as a personal act of defiance but as a reflection of a larger struggle in democratic systems. When elected officials or leaders attempt to enforce control by excluding voices they find inconvenient, it raises questions about what kind of democracy is being practiced. For those observing, it draws attention to the fragility of freedoms that are often taken for granted. The authority to command security to physically remove someone from a platform carries a weight that goes beyond order. It symbolizes control over who gets to participate in the political conversation. For many Americans who value open dialogue, Crockett's fearless stand becomes not just a personal act of courage but an emblem of resistance. The psychological dynamic at play in such confrontations is also telling. Authority figures like Trump often expect compliance when they issue commands, especially in spaces where their power is recognized and amplified by loyal supporters. The assumption is that dissent will either retreat quietly or be forcibly removed, preserving the dominance of the authority figure. But when someone like Crockett breaks this expectation, speaking out in defiance before security can enforce removal, it flips the power dynamic. Instead of being the dominant force, authority suddenly appears threatened, disrupted by a voice that refuses to be controlled. This disruption often resonates deeply with audiences, because it reflects the universal human struggle between being silenced and being heard. It reminds people that authority is not absolute, that even in the face of overwhelming power, fearless opposition can find a way to speak truth. Another important layer to this confrontation lies in the public perception of such moments. Authority is effective only if it maintains legitimacy in the eyes of the people. When attempts to silence opposition are broadcast, whether through news outlets, social media, or personal accounts, they invite scrutiny. The audience is left to interpret whether authority was justified or whether it abused its position. In this case, Trump's move to call for security may have been seen by some as an assertion of order, but by many others, it came across as an attempt to stifle dissent, further polarizing opinions. Crockett's response, on the other hand, gained power precisely because it was unexpected, courageous, and unapologetic. By refusing to be removed quietly, she created a narrative where fearless opposition stood its ground against authority. This shift in perception demonstrates how confrontations of power and resistance play out not only in the room where they happen but across the national conversation that follows. The broader implications of this clash extend into the principles of free speech and democratic resilience. Authority figures, no matter how influential, cannot fully control the narrative when opposition is both fearless and strategic. The effort to silence can backfire, making the dissenting voice louder than it would have been if left alone. In many ways, Crockett's act of speaking before being silenced served as a lesson in how to navigate confrontations with authority. Instead of shrinking back, she expanded her presence, showing that fearless opposition can disarm even the most powerful commands. This struggle between authority and opposition becomes a metaphor for the ongoing political landscape where leaders, citizens, and institutions are constantly negotiating the boundaries of power and freedom. Courage in politics is often discussed in abstract terms, but moments like these show it in practice. True courage is not about speaking when it is easy or convenient but about speaking when the stakes are high and the outcome uncertain. Crockett's willingness to voice her truth despite Trump's command for her removal highlights how courage defies intimidation. For many observers, this act was not just about one person making a statement but about the larger principle of resisting the erosion of free expression. By speaking when she knew she was moments away from being silenced, she captured the essence of political bravery, which is the refusal to bow to fear even under the pressure of authority and its mechanisms of control. Such actions resonate deeply because they remind people that courage in politics often begins with one individual daring to break the expected script. This decision also reveals the strategic understanding Crockett had of the power of timing. Politics is as much about when something is said as it is about what is said. She understood that if she allowed herself to be escorted away without speaking, her silence would have been remembered as compliance. Instead, by speaking before she was silenced, she ensured that her voice would echo louder than any attempt to erase it. This was not just instinct but a recognition of the political theater at play. Audiences inside the room and beyond it through media would see that she was not passively removed but actively resisted with words, leaving an impression that could not be erased by security or silencing. Timing turned her act of defiance into a story, and stories in politics are often more powerful than commands. Another layer of significance lies in how her action challenges the culture of intimidation that pervades political spaces. When figures like Trump use authority to silence opposition, it creates an atmosphere where others may hesitate to speak for fear of retribution or embarrassment. Crockett's refusal to comply with this culture becomes a signal to others that intimidation can be resisted, that courage is contagious. Her voice became more than her own. It became a representation of every voice that has been silenced or pushed aside in political spaces dominated by authority. This kind of courage has a ripple effect, inspiring those who witness it to question the limits imposed on them and to consider their own power to resist when they face suppression. The symbolism of this moment stretches into broader debates about democracy and representation. In a system that prides itself on freedom of expression, moments when individuals must summon extraordinary courage just to be heard expose the fragility of those freedoms. Crockett's act of speaking demonstrated how much weight a single voice can carry when it is amplified by the audacity to defy silencing. Her decision reaffirmed the principle that democracy is not sustained by authority alone but by the courage of individuals who insist on participating even when they are told to leave. By daring to speak, she highlighted that participation in politics is not a privilege granted by those in power but a right that belongs to everyone, and protecting that right requires courage every time it is threatened. The public reaction to such courage further underlines its power. Audiences who saw Crockett's decision were not just watching a confrontation but witnessing a living example of resistance. For some, it may have been a moment of inspiration, proof that even against a dominant figure like Trump, opposition could assert itself. For others, it became a reminder that courage is what shifts narratives in politics. Words delivered under pressure are remembered differently. They are etched into memory because they symbolize defiance. Crockett's words, however brief, gained longevity because of the environment in which they were spoken. Her courage turned a fleeting moment into a lasting message that continues to circulate and influence public discussion. At its heart, this incident underscores that voice and courage are inseparable in politics. Voice without courage may falter when challenged, and courage without voice remains unseen. Crockett brought the two together in a way that exposed the limits of authority while elevating the strength of dissent. She showed that the act of speaking, when done boldly and at the right moment, can pierce through attempts at suppression and resonate with an audience far larger than the immediate crowd. In this way, her decision was not only about asserting her own presence but about reclaiming the space for dissent itself. It proved that courage in politics is not a matter of titles or positions but of choosing to speak when silence is demanded, and that choice remains one of the most powerful tools available to anyone who dares to resist suppression. The incident sparks wider debates on freedom of speech, democracy, and the importance of standing firm against intimidation because it touches on fundamental values that define the political and social fabric of any nation. Freedom of speech has always been one of the cornerstones of democracy, the very principle that allows individuals to challenge authority, express dissent, and ensure that no single voice dominates the public discourse. When Trump called for security to remove Jasmine Crockett, the optics of that decision raised critical questions about whether silencing dissent undermines the spirit of democratic exchange. The fact that Crockett managed to speak before being silenced turned the moment into a symbolic struggle between authority and liberty, making it impossible to ignore the tension between power and the right to express opposition. Such incidents draw attention to how fragile freedoms can become when authority feels threatened and seeks to stifle the voices that question it. Freedom of speech is not merely about the legal right to speak but about the societal willingness to allow dissent, even when it is uncomfortable or inconvenient. Political spaces are meant to be arenas of debate, but when attempts are made to eject individuals whose voices disrupt the narrative, it highlights how fragile those freedoms can feel in practice. This is why Crockett's resistance matters. It underscored that freedom of speech is not theoretical but must be actively defended in real time, especially when authority seeks to limit it. The debates that emerge from this confrontation go far beyond one person or one event. They raise the issue of whether dissenters in democratic systems are truly protected, or whether those protections evaporate the moment their presence challenges powerful figures. Every act of silencing, whether successful or not, becomes a test case for the strength of democratic institutions. Democracy thrives on contestation, on the clash of voices and ideas that ultimately shape policy and culture. When voices are excluded or suppressed, democracy itself becomes weaker because it fails to represent the full range of perspectives. Crockett's choice to speak even as security was called highlighted the importance of protecting those spaces where opposition can be expressed. Her defiance symbolized a reminder that democracy is not guaranteed, it must be constantly reinforced by individuals who insist on being heard. The broader debate this sparked is about whether democratic systems are robust enough to handle dissent or whether they bend under the weight of powerful individuals who prefer control over dialogue. The willingness of citizens and leaders alike to protect spaces for free expression determines how resilient democracy will remain in the face of intimidation. Standing firm against intimidation becomes a central lesson from this incident, as it demonstrates that courage in politics is not only about personal bravery but about defending the principles that sustain democratic life. Intimidation has long been a tool used by authority to discourage opposition, whether through physical removal, rhetorical attacks, or the creation of hostile environments. By refusing to retreat in silence, Crockett exposed the limits of intimidation. She showed that its effectiveness depends on compliance, and when someone stands firm, the strategy begins to falter. For those watching, this act of resistance serves as a powerful reminder that intimidation does not have to succeed, that individuals armed with conviction can disrupt even the most forceful attempts to silence them. The wider debates around intimidation highlight how essential it is for societies to create protections and cultural norms that empower people to resist without fear of retribution. The symbolic power of this confrontation also extends into conversations about representation in politics. Crockett, as a woman of color in a space often dominated by male authority figures, carried an additional weight in her defiance. Her willingness to confront authority head-on amplifies discussions about who gets to speak, who is often silenced, and how these dynamics reflect deeper issues of inequality in political systems. The attempt to remove her can be read as part of a broader pattern where marginalized voices are more frequently targeted for suppression. Her refusal to be silenced challenges that pattern and opens debates about how democratic systems can ensure genuine inclusivity rather than selective participation. Freedom of speech in a democracy must extend to all voices, not just those deemed acceptable by authority. Another important element in this broader debate is the role of the public in sustaining democratic freedoms. Authority can attempt to silence, opposition can resist, but it is the public that ultimately determines which side holds legitimacy. When audiences see someone like Crockett standing firm against intimidation, they are invited to reflect on their own role in protecting free expression. Do they support those who resist, or do they normalize the silencing of dissent? These questions form the foundation of wider democratic debates, as the health of a democracy is measured not only by its institutions but also by the culture of its people. If citizens become indifferent to intimidation, freedom of speech withers. If they rally behind those who resist, democratic values are strengthened. Crockett's defiance served as a rallying point for many who saw in her actions the embodiment of democratic resilience. The incident also sparked discussions about accountability for authority. When powerful figures seek to silence opposition, they expose their own insecurities, revealing that control is more important to them than open dialogue. This undermines the very legitimacy of their leadership in the eyes of many, because democracy is supposed to be rooted in persuasion, not coercion. By creating a spectacle of silencing, Trump inadvertently invited scrutiny over his commitment to democratic principles, while Crockett's resistance highlighted the contrast between suppression and courage. Debates that followed centered on whether leaders should be held to higher standards of tolerance for dissent and whether attempts to silence opposition should be treated as violations of democratic norms. These questions remain vital in a political climate where authority and freedom constantly collide. Ultimately, the confrontation between Trump and Crockett becomes more than a singular political drama. It becomes a mirror reflecting the state of democracy, freedom of speech, and the courage required to stand against intimidation. It illustrates that democracy cannot survive if authority is allowed to silence at will, and it cannot flourish without individuals willing to resist. Freedom of speech exists not just in constitutions and laws but in the everyday decisions of people who choose to use their voices even when facing the threat of suppression. This is why the incident resonated so widely. It crystallized the tension between authority and freedom, sparking debates that reached to the very core of what it means to live in and fight for a democratic society.